Have you ever wondered what a cubit is? Well, I know I have, and it crops up in the translations of many old works, in Pliny, in the Bible even. Well, it actually comes from the Latin word for elbow, cubitum. And it was a measurement used in former days that literally corresponded to the distance from your elbow to the end of your longest finger, usually your middle finger, right? So that's some pretty interesting trivia, but it's not half as interesting as the word elbow itself, or at least how the Latin cubitum evolved in the various Romance languages. Most of the time, cognates across the Romance languages are pretty similar. For example, the Latin herba for grass gave us hierba in Spanish, erva in Portuguese, herbe in French, and erba in Italian. You can see the family similarity clear as day there. But there are some exceptions, and cubitum is one of them. Let's look at what these languages did to it. Elbows are fascinating. And that's a statement I never thought I'd say, and I don't think I'll be saying it again anytime soon. And when I say elbow, of course, what I really am referring to is cubitum, the Latin word for elbow, and how it's been adapted into the various Romance languages. Because in each of the 4 major Romance languages we typically cover on this channel, the evolution of cubitum is a snapshot of how those Romance languages function. And today, we're going to only look at 2 because there's so much we can say on this topic that it's necessary to limit ourselves for now. The next episode will cover Italian and Portuguese, but right now we're looking at French and Spanish. And we're going to start with Spanish. And in no necessary chronological order, this is how cubitum in Latin became the modern Spanish word for elbow. Let's start with the original Latin, cubitum. If you remember our video on syncope, you'll know that Spanish had this tendency to eliminate unstressed Latin vowels in the middle of words. Cubitum is an example of what's considered secondary syncope in Spanish. The unstressed syllable b in the center of the word disappeared, giving us cutum. Then we have the case of voicing. We looked at this before. Spanish has this tendency to take unvoiced intervocalic consonants in Latin and voice them. That's why we get vida from vita in Latin. So from cutum, we get cudum. Then a Romance language-wide phenomenon affects Spanish as well, which is the disappearance of the final nasal consonant M. This was widely present, of course, in Latin. And it's important to understand that even in Latin, it wouldn't have been pronounced with a closed bilabial that we use today. For example, if I were to say oppidum, you'll notice that I close my mouth fully and say But the Romans likely would have nasalized the previous vowel and not necessarily pronounced this as an M. So oppidum for a Roman might have been more like oppidum. This, if I'm not mistaken, is certainly the opinion of Luc Ranieri, who is the resource to go to here on YouTube for Latin pronunciation. So this cudum wouldn't necessarily been pronounced by late Latin speakers as cudum, but more like cudum. And it's easy to see there how that nasalized consonant might have fallen away over time, it not intrinsically being emphasized very much. So we've moved from cubitum to cutum to cudum to cudu. But then, how do those u vowel qualities in Latin become o in Spanish? Well, actually, it turns out that this isn't a particularly strange phenomenon. In fact, it seems to have applied across Iberian Romance in general. Unstressed Latin u became o pretty regularly. This is why Latin lupus is lobo in Spanish and Portuguese lobo. But that, of course, leaves the question, why? Why does o become u? And there are a few theories that I have found on the internet. Now, I'm going to say this off the top of my head, so if I get anything wrong, please let me know in the comments below here. One theory is that Latin u was actually pronounced a little bit more like So cubitum might have actually been pronounced something more like cubito. According to that theory, the tongue in that vowel quality is very close to the quality that we eventually get in Spanish. And so it really isn't a particularly dramatic transition. Now, the other theory that I find slightly more likely is linked to the phenomenon of the disappearance of the final nasal consonant m. Essentially, the idea goes that the standard position, it's almost the resting position of our tongues and our mouths between words and between syllables, is a mid position. And of course, here what's important to understand is that what distinguishes u from o is the difference between u being a high vowel quality and o being a mid vowel quality. That is to say that our tongue is held in a higher position for u and in a mid position for o. Now, if it's true that the resting position of our tongue is pretty much close to an o anyway, when late Latin speakers finally do away with the nasalized consonant m totally, and coude becomes coude, it became easy for speakers to almost ignore the ending of that word and leave their tongues in the resting mid position. I'm not sure whether either of those theories hold water in your opinion, but they were the two that seemed to me most likely, and I tend to lean towards the second one here. And that, in short, is how we go from Latin cubitum to codo in Spanish. But I'm not finished yet, because I want to look at French. French is a fascinating example of lexical evolution that's followed almost exactly the same phonological processes that Spanish did, but came out slightly different. So we definitely have in French the phenomenon of syncopation. The B in cubitum disappears. But what's particularly interesting here is that you'll notice that the modern French word coude retains an U sound. And this actually seems to have been a phenomenon widespread in Old French. We have attested that in Old French, Latin unstressed U became a diphthongized U. Is the same evolution that gives us lup from lupus. We have the case of voicing as well that affected Spanish. The T became pronounced as a D. And then, of course, the major difference is the word end. We don't see a mid or high vowel there. And the answer that I've come across most regularly is that this also might have something to do with the disappearance of the nasalized Latin ending. As that disappeared, Old French speakers tended to ignore the rest of the word entirely. And that's how we move from cubitum to French coude. So that is going to be all for our discussion of elbows for today. Join us for our next video in which we'll be looking at how Italian and Portuguese, and also English, transformed the original Latin. For now, I'll say gracias and merci for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.